In May of 1945, shortly after the surrender of the Germans, a nationalist uprising broke out in French-mandated Syria, which caused the French forces to react, killing several hundred civilians. Churchill was determined to maintain good relations with the Arab states, so he sent in British forces that had been stationed in Transjordan to intervene and stop the violence, forcing the French forces back to their barracks. The move to overpower the French angered Charles de Gaulle severely, to the point limited war almost broke out between the UK and France in what became known as the Levant Crisis, which ultimately saw the French lose control of Syria the following year. Also in May, Churchill ordered the drawing up of contingency plans known as Operation Unthinkable, which would see Britain and the US immediately turn on the Soviets by pushing them out of Central Europe, but the plan was never realized. With the 1945 election rapidly approaching, the Labour members of the coalition refused to continue to participate, leading to Churchill's resignation. At the King's request, Churchill agreed to form a new coalition government, this time with the Liberals. In July, Churchill, Stalin, and now U.S. President Harry S. Truman, following FDR's death, met for the final Big Three conference at Potsdam, where the Allies turned their attention to the war in Pacific, and with the borders being China and French Indochina also being demarcated. During the conference, it was reported that Churchill's drunken behavior was appalling and offensive, which contrasted with his Labour envoy Clement Attlee. In a desperate move before the election, Churchill went on the radio and declared that the Labour Party would have to lead with Gestapo tactics to implement their plans, a remark that backfired, leading him and the Conservatives to lose the election, with Churchill resigning and being followed by Attlee. While Churchill's boisterousness and resolve to return Britain to normalcy served him well during wartime, now that the conflict was over and the country lay in ruins, the people longed for a strong government, not in firepower, but in the willingness to help people rebuild their lives. Attlee soared to victory on a promise to greatly expand the British welfare state to support the middle class. Attlee would simultaneously pursue an enlargement of the state by nationalizing key industries, starting with the Bank of England and Civil Airlines in 1946. That year, he championed the Coal Industry Nationalization Act, which brought all coal mines under government control and established the National Coal Board to regulate prices and supply based on how the coal boards operated during the two world wars. The following year, Parliament passed the Electricity Act of 1947, which nationalized the electric grid by creating another regulating body called the British Electricity Authority. Also that year, the Transport Act of 1947 nationalized and combined the big four national railways into a single state-owned enterprise known as British Railways, which would be managed by the newly established British Transport Commission. The big four included Great Western Railway, one of the earliest and most powerful railways, founded in 1833, which connected London to Birmingham, Bristol, and Wales. The remaining three were all created as the result of the Railways Act of 1921, which ordered Britain's 119 other smaller railways to consolidate into three peer competitors. These included the London, Midland, and Scottish Railway, which ran up through the populated Midlands, servicing Birmingham and Manchester and connecting London to Scotland, and which itself had ended up being the largest rail company due to the immense number of mergers undertaken. The London and Northeastern Railway, known as LNER, similarly connected London to Scotland in a vertical route, but took a more easterly route servicing Manchester, Leeds, York, and Newcastle. Finally, the Southern Railway spread across southern England, connecting London with Plymouth, Southampton, Portsmouth, and Kent. Additionally, an early British telegraph behemoth, Cable and Wireless, was brought under total government control. The company had originally been founded in 1869 to build and maintain British telegraph lines used to connect their vast imperial territories. The company had been briefly nationalized before during both world wars, and it was considered an easy argument to bring them under permanent control for national security reasons. The Pensions Increase Act of 1947 essentially tripled the pension payments offered to veterans for their service in the World Wars. This was followed by the Gas Act of 1948, which nationalized the gas industry and established the Gas Council as a regulatory body. That year, the famed National Health Service was established, offering essential medical care to all citizens, and introduced regulations surrounding the handling and storage of radioactive substances, which by now were understood as carcinogenic. The Iron and Steel Act of 1949 deviated from the pattern of complete government control by allowing mining companies to continue operating as for-profit enterprises and instead exerting their control over them by becoming the majority shareholder through the forced sale of stock. The large array of reforms brought about by the Attlee government was leading to a currency crisis, as foreign debt from the war ballooned as the relative value of the pound decreased. With the Lend-Lease Agreement expiring in 1945, the UK and US agreed to a new Anglo-American loan, which stipulated that the pound could be directly converted to the US dollar. When this treatment was rolled out in 1947, it created a massive balance of payments crisis, and the convertibility had to be suspended. Despite the issues with the value of the pound and international trade balances, Attlee's government was able to maintain almost total employment due to their focus on labor as being a number one priority, and during his administration, 1,016,000 new homes were constructed to replenish the housing stock destroyed by German bombing, which kickstarted a large multinational British home building industry, which continues today. Beyond economic hardship, the winter of 1947 was especially brutal, and widespread power outages and food insecurity were reported across Britain. Shortages of coal and food almost led to the downfall of Attlee's government, but due to his relative popularity, he was able to stave off these threats. Attlee believed the best way to treat the Soviets now that the war was over was to be firm but friendly, and he authorized the sale of 55 Rolls-Royce jet engines to the USSR with the expressed agreement that the engines would only be used for civilian purposes. The Soviets, at this point far behind the West in jet engine technology, reverse engineered the jets and ended up producing them for their big fighter jets, a strategic blunder by Attlee. To counter Soviet expansion, Attlee championed a collective security agreement under NATO and supported the U.S. Marshall Plan to help rebuild war-torn countries and maintain Western Europe under American and British influence. Many more left-wing members of the Labour Party believed the country should take a neutral stance in the Cold War between the Soviets and Americans in a movement they called Keep Left. While the economic assistance from the U.S. ultimately kept the Labour Party in their orbit, Attlee made the consequential decision to begin funding an independent nuclear deterrent to maintain British sovereignty. Dock workers in London went on a widespread strike in 1949, which led by the British Communist Party. While Attlee was able to end the strike by sending in 13,000 troops, the event made it clear that domestic communist organizations had the potential to be influenced by Moscow and should thus be monitored and feared. At this time, the civil war in China was coming to an end, with the communists seemingly coming out on top. Despite lost fears of property due to Chinese nationalization, Attlee decided that establishing a positive relationship with a stable and industrializing China was important to resume British economic expansion into Asia. Britain became the first Western government to recognize Communist China in 1950, with Attlee being the first Western leader to meet Mao Zedong. Attlee realized that continued British colonialism was untenable due to economic and military limitations, and he passed the Indian Independence Act of 1947, which ended British rule on the subcontinent. During World War II, the Muslim League lent considerable support to the British, and thus it was agreed that upon independence, India would be partitioned into separate Muslim and Hindu states of Pakistan, East Pakistan, and India. The so-called Radcliffe Line demarcated the new borders in the ethnically mixed Punjab and Bengal regions. The regions were not cleanly split among ethnic lines, and the partition caused widespread relocation and sectarian violence. Shortly after India was granted its independence, Attlee extended this to Burma and Ceylon, now known as Myanmar and Sri Lanka, respectively. Out of all British colonial territories, Mandatory Palestine proved to be the most troublesome and expensive. The British tried to maintain peace between the increasing Jewish immigrants and Palestinian residents. The Zionists, who saw British control as an impediment to a Jewish state, began an insurgency with the Jewish paramilitary group, the Haganah, bombing key infrastructure used by their British overseers and assassinating British military officers. Attlee attempted to limit Jewish influence over Palestine by ordering MI6 to intercept boats leaving Europe that were filled with Jews immigrating to Palestine as part of Aliyah Bet by capturing the Jewish refugees and imprisoning them in concentration camps on Cyprus. Once this covert treatment of Jewish refugees was reported to the public, opinion turned against continual governing of mandatory Palestine, and Attlee ordered the withdrawal from the area in 1948, which instigated the Arab-Israeli Civil War, which would ultimately lead to the creation of an independent Israel. Following the withdrawal, Attlee would maintain a hostile relationship with the Israeli government, believing that they would cause chaos across the wider Middle East. Despite these retreats, the Attlee government had not given up on colonialism, and a newfound focus was applied to Britain's colonies in Africa through the opening of additional military bases and investment in infrastructure with the goal of raising the continent's standard of living. These efforts did not always go smoothly, evidenced by the Tanganyika groundnut scheme. Tanganyika is now known as Tanzania. It had been a German colonial possession until its seizure by the British in World War I. Attlee's plan in post-war Tanganyika was to develop a mechanized agriculture industry by ordering the cultivation of 3 million acres of peanuts. The hastily developed plan became a major failure as nobody in the government had taken the time to research the local climate and soil, which was objectively poor for the growing of peanuts, and after sinking $1 billion into the project, it was abandoned in 1951. Despite his vast efforts, the British middle class still felt economic hardship following the war, and a plan to institute austerity measures to ensure Britain could participate in the Korean War faced widespread backlash, leading Attlee to lose the election in 1951, being followed once again by conservative Winston Churchill. At the time of his second premiership, Churchill's health was declining due to a series of strokes. King George VI intended to ask Churchill to resign in 1952, but the king died himself before he could deliver the news, being followed by Queen Elizabeth II, who would go on to become a major ally of Churchill's and would support the transition of the British Empire to a new, more loosely connected alliance called the Commonwealth of Nations. Churchill, above all else, believed Attlee's efforts towards decolonization were detrimental to Britain's international standing, and he was determined to stop further splintering of the empire. Despite his determination, he was unable to stop Egyptian Colonel Abdel Nasser's revolution in 1952, ultimately conceding defeat by evacuating British forces from the country. The British would further cede control over British Sudan in 1956 under the agreement that Egypt would not invade and try to take control over the territory. While Malaya had gained its nominal independence in 1948, the government was still much in favor of maintaining its position in the Commonwealth. During World War II, the British armed and trained Malaysian communist fighters to resist the Japanese, who would later turn their sights on the British and the Western-backed government in what became known as the Malayan Emergency. The British reacted with a heavy hand, committing many atrocities, including the Batang Kali massacre, where Scottish soldiers captured a rebel-held rubber plant and proceeded to round up and shoot 25 male workers, killing all but one who fainted at the sight of the killing and crumbled to the floor, being presumed dead. To cover their liability, the government would pass a new retroactive military regulation permitting the killing of unarmed enemies in an effort to stop escapes. To this day, the British government does not recognize the massacre and has never paid compensation. Even more disturbing was the widespread practice of headhunting, where British soldiers and their allies would hunt down suspected communists and decapitate them, oftentimes displaying the dead bodies in public spaces to scare other potential insurgents. Although the gruesome killings were ignored by most of mainstream media, news of the headhunting eventually trickled in, causing public outrage, forcing Churchill to call for the stopping of the practice, albeit with no stated punishment. To cut off the insurgency's access to the peasants who supported their movement, the British under General Sir Harold Briggs executed the Briggs Plan, which saw the mass relocation of 500,000 ethnically Chinese peasants into concentration camps, which were called New Villages. By the end of the decade, the draconian tactics by the British had crushed the communist revolution, and colonial control was maintained. Also, beginning in 1952, was the infamous Mau Mau Rebellion, in which a group of allied tribes in British Kenya rose up against colonial rule. The rebellion ceased to exist after the rebel leader Dedan Kimathi was captured in 1956 and executed due to infighting amongst various Kenyan ethnic groups and a lack of widespread support for the Mau Mau due to large swaths of the population being perceived colonial loyalists. The British reacted brutally, capturing and interning 240,000 civilians into concentration camps. They subjected suspected Mau Mau supporters to extensive torture, including burning eardrums with lit cigarettes and genital mutilation. An interesting yet disturbing anecdote was that Barack Obama's grandfather, Hussein Onyango Obama, was one of these victims of intense sexual torture, who would later take the British Army to trial and send several soldiers to prison for this torture in extrajudicial killings in the Chuka and Hola massacres, although the longest sentence served would be a measly 6 years. The Mau Mau themselves were not innocent of war crimes, in particular against rival tribes who did not support the rebellion. The most notable Mau Mau war crime occurred in the 1953 Lari massacre, where they ambushed a village and forced inhabitants into a few central huts, lighting them on fire and burning them alive, killing 76. Many in the Mau Mau movement did not approve of such inhumane treatment of fellow Kenyans, a principal reason the movement began to splinter. In a reaction to the massacre, the Kenyan police in turn killed 150 of the Mau Mau. Additionally, 71 of the Mau Mau perpetrators of the attack were sentenced to death after standing trial in Kenyan court. In all, the Mau Mau ended up killing 3,410 rival Kenyans compared to just 32 British. Of the murdered British, the killing of 6-year-old Michael Ruck, who was hacked to death with a machete, garnered the most public outrage. Photographs of Michael's dead body next to blood-soaked stuffed animals and a toy train set were widespread in Kenyan media, increasing the number of loyalists, and by 1956 the rebellion was crushed. By April of 1955, Churchill's health had declined so significantly that he chose to step down, being followed by fellow conservative Anthony Eden. Churchill would remain a member of parliament for the next 10 years, passing away in 1965 at the age of 90.